Hi everyone, welcome to our module on innovation diffusion and behaviour change. So this module is focusing on, I guess, one of the most critical elements of the innovation process. So when we've defined innovation, we've said it's a multi-stage process. We've said that innovations can be products or processes, be related to services or a lot of different sorts of things. They can be radical or incremental, so big or small. But at the end of the day, if we really want to distill it and break it down, innovation is largely this. It's made up of very broadly two components. One is around creativity or coming up with a new idea, adapting a new idea, bringing an idea into the unit of adoption or the place where you want it to be implemented. And the second stage is actually implementing it, so getting people to adopt your innovation. And it's that second part that we're really focusing on today. That's at the heart of what innovation diffusion is about. So I would anticipate that you've been exposed to this idea of innovation diffusion and innovation diffusion theory, possibly in your introduction to entrepreneurship and innovation course, if you've done that. If you're doing advanced innovation management, you've probably also been exposed to this idea as well. So we're going to go into it in a little bit more depth, I think, in this course. And we're also going to tack on, although it's not just to tack on, it's also very important and links to innovation diffusion, this idea of behaviour change. So we'll look at a few models of how specifically we can understand why people behave the way they do and how we can influence that in the context of innovation. So at the end of this lecture, I want you to be able to explain and apply the key components of innovation diffusion theory. It's quite a broad theory. It's complex in parts, but we're going to break it down a little bit. I don't expect you to know it all in a great high level of detail, but I want you to be able to explain what innovation diffusion theory is, and I want you to be able to understand, explain, and apply the key components that I will be focusing us on in this lecture. I want you also to be able to identify and explain the range of factors that can impact on whether an innovation is successful or not, and that will relate to the diffusion theory that we're going to be talking about. And lastly, I want you to be able to explain this idea of behaviour change, human behaviour change, and particularly I want you to understand, be able to discuss, and be able to apply the different models. We'll look at a few of them at the end of the lecture, apply those different models of behaviour change in an innovation context. So largely this lecture is broken up into two parts. So first we're going to focus on innovation diffusion theory, and that is really focused at the group level. So that's understanding how groups or teams of people, they're situated in a group context, how they move towards adopting an innovation or not. And then sort of the second part of the lecture, which will be a bit shorter, we're going to focus on those behaviour change models, and that's much more aligned to individual behaviour rather than looking at it at the group level. So innovation diffusion, what does it mean? I wanted to start with this slide just to give you a sense of, innovation diffusion. It occurs in so many different and so many broad ways. So I guess in our course we are focused on probably organisations, white collar, maybe blue collar, might be knowledge workers, might be workers engaged in manufacturing or production, that kind of thing. But actually innovations happen across a whole range of different organisations, and you'll see one of the readings for this week, the reading around behaviour change, Pavanta et al., that book chapter. They're very much health focused, and so when you go searching for literature on innovation diffusion, it's quite interesting that a fair bit of it is focused on or in the health field or the social work field, which relates to another one of the readings that we've got in there. So it's interesting, I guess, just to think of innovation in that broad way. So I want you to do that throughout this lecture, and I'm sure the readings will be forcing you really to do this anyway, to think about innovations not just within our sort of stereotypical organisations that I suppose we think about in business degrees, but to look more broadly as well into different industries and different sectors. So on this slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of what does innovation diffusion look like in some different sectors, and here it's focused on health. So for example, I think it shows us some of the key components that we're going to be talking about. If you look at the second dot point there, so for example, vitamin A deficiency in Nepal, needing to engage in some innovative activities to bring that level of deficiency down. So what did these organisations, probably health organisations, do to enact that innovation, to encourage people in the community to adopt certain behaviours to improve their vitamin A deficiency? Well, you can see that they engaged in what's called neighbourhood or neighbour social modelling, and that comes to how do you engage people in the community, their neighbours, their peers, friends, their social networks in their community, to spread information to encourage people to engage in a certain type of behaviour that relates to the innovation you're trying to get people to adopt. And you can see all of those dot points there relate to that kind of theme, and that's one of the key themes running through this lecture. How do you get individuals and groups to change their behaviour in some way? Because at the end of the day, and we've talked about this before, innovation is about change in some sense. It's about getting people to do something even just a little bit differently. And there are lots of ways that we can encourage people to do that. So here we come to innovation diffusion theory. So you can see I've got I guess one of the most important references in this week's module is Rogers 2003, and that's in another reading called Hoffman 2007. And Hoffman was a great reading that I came across because it nicely summarises Rogers' work, which I think actually comes out of an entire book. But Rogers is a seminal author here who really framed this innovation diffusion theory, and the Pavanta et al. Reading is obviously a very important one for our behaviour change models that we'll get to. But essentially, innovation diffusion theory describes how new ideas or innovations are spread within different systems, usually systems of people. Now, on the previous slide, we were looking at communities and we're looking at health-focused innovations. But of course, diffusion theory is also relevant in our more stereotypical organisations that we look at: banks, financial services, manufacturing, production, whatever. Wherever there are people, wherever you're wanting to spread a new idea, diffusion theory will play some role in helping you to understand how to do that. So generally what diffusion theory says is, look, okay, it's a new idea you're trying to put out there that you're trying to get people to adopt in some way. And one of the key ways that individuals go about this adoption process is firstly by trying to understand what an innovation is all about. And they're trying to reduce the uncertainty that they have around that particular innovation, whether it's big or small, that they will have some degree of uncertainty about what is supposed to happen here. What does this mean for me? It's new in some way. It's asking me to change in some way. How do I gather information to help me reduce my uncertainty about those things? Also in diffusion theory, which we'll come to, one of the important things that it talks about is how you can actually segment your audiences that you're presenting this innovation to. So we'll look at this idea of opinion leaders, or what you might call influencers. We'll look at different categories of adopters. But basically, diffusion theory is quite important and useful because it helps us to understand, well, everyone that we're trying to get to adopt this innovation, they're not the same. They'll have different rates of adoption. They'll have different interests in the innovation. They'll perceive it in different ways. Therefore, you need to target your messages in different ways to reach those different audiences. So for some of you, if you've done marketing courses, or maybe you're doing a marketing major, you might see some common threads here with some of that work. So some of what we're talking about here in terms of segmenting your audience and identifying your target audience or target market, I guess, in a way, you might find some similarities with some of the marketing concepts and ideas you've been exposed to. So diffusion occurs through a combination of a few things, is what our diffusion theory says. First, individuals need to reduce their uncertainty when they're presented with something new, which we were just talking about before. Individuals, they need to respond to these perceptions by thinking about what others are doing. So this relates to one of our modules around social networks, that people look to their peers, they look to people, both their strong and weak ties within their networks, to see what they're doing, whether they're adopting innovation, what they think about the innovation, and they will then shape their own behaviour around what others are doing. And that relates to point C as well. You start to get a social or normative pressure here sometimes. Once innovations begin to be adopted more and more and more, the early adopters start to place some pressure upon later adopters to adopt whatever it is that your innovation is about. So there, a social pressure can gather momentum as well as innovations begin to work their way into a system. So innovation diffusion theory, there's a few elements here, and we're going to go through pretty much all of those in a little bit more detail. So firstly, of course, there's got to be some sort of innovation. And in particular, people need to have perceptions about that innovation's different attributes. So that's a really important part of diffusion theory. You have an innovation, whatever it is, whether it's a product or a process or a service, and there are some attributes or things that people can think about that innovation. So if it's a product, they can think about what it looks like and how they might use it and what it means and those sorts of things. So you have an innovation. Secondly, it's communicated through certain channels. So this comes to thinking about your audience, segmenting your audience, your target audience. You need to communicate to those people what this change or what this innovation is all about. So there are a few different ways you can do that. We'll talk a little bit about change agents who can be brought in specifically to organisations to promote communication, to particularly target certain individuals who might be what we will come to call opinion leaders, who are very important or central in organisational networks to help further spread the message more effectively and more efficiently. So communication obviously is important. You have some different channels to do that in, and we've touched on that in our interpersonal communication skills module as well. Point 3 there, so diffusion happens over time. It doesn't necessarily happen instantaneously. So we'll look at what we call the individual adoption process, which happens over time and basically sets out a few stages that people will go through in the adoption process, what we will term awareness, persuasion, decision, implementation and continuation, so whether people continue on with an innovation or end up rejecting it. And obviously innovations and the diffusion of them and the encouragement of adoption of them occurs in a social system. So we're talking about organisations largely here, and whether it's in a health context, which some of our readings talk about in this module, whether it's in a university context or whatever, it's in some sort of organisational setting with human beings, it's with people. So we'll look at what we call some different adopter categories. And again, that comes back to this idea of targeting and segmenting our audience, thinking about who can we send certain messages to, are there people that we can speak to first who might then be very influential for other people and really help us get a roll on with our adoption process. So we'll look at this idea of innovation happening in a social system as well. But at the end of the day, at its heart, I suppose, diffusion theory is about understanding what can improve the rate of adoption of an innovation, and that's that last point there. And the rate of adoption is the relative speed with which an innovation is adopted by members of a social system. So for all of those different components, those 4 components or so that I've just briefly talked through there, what they're trying to get to is getting us to a point where we can increase and speed up the adoption of our particular innovation by looking at these different elements. And if you're a visual person, that's kind of what all of those things brought together look like in a bit of a diagram. So we won't look at point 2 there, type of innovation decision, in a great deal of detail. I'll briefly touch on it, but those other ones we will look at in a little bit more detail. Each of those other 4 there. And again, when we look at those, what we're focused on is understanding how we can leverage each of those components to heighten, increase the efficiency and uptake of our particular innovation. So let's take a break and then we'll start going through those different components of diffusion theory, and we'll start with the attributes or characteristics of the innovation.